Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Boston. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1866. Boston was a city of narrow lanes, slanted rooftops and damp cellars, where the smell of coal smoke mixed with salt drifting from the harbor. The Civil War had ended only a year earlier, but its shadow still hung over the port. Widows in mourning black, veterans missing eyes or limbs, and children who had grown up on hushed talk of loss. Among those children was a pale, silent boy named Jesse Pomeroy, whose strange demeanor had already drawn quiet talk among the families of South Boston. Jesse was not known for play or laughter. He watched the other boys at the docks the way a crow watches movement, with a still, calculating stare. His mother, Ruth, ran a small dressmaking business out of their worn wooden house near Broadway, and often told neighbors that Jesse's father, a harsh Civil War veteran, had disciplined him too early too often. Yet, even those who pitied the boy could not deny there was something unnerving about him. In early autumn, a local watchman reported a peculiar sight near the dry docks. A boy crouched in the reeds at dusk, whispering to something unseen in the mud. The report was never followed up. There were other small things: a kitten found skinned behind the carpenter's shop, a paperboy who returned home with a bleeding ear and refused to name who had done it. Boston's police, burdened with drunken sailors and post-war unrest, paid little attention to children's quarrels. By the winter of 1867, strange disappearances began to ripple through the poorer quarters. The first name recorded in the Boston Daily Advertiser was Thomas Quinn, aged 4, last seen following an older boy toward the old Marsh Road. Within days, rumors whispered that the same pale boy with the gray eyes had been seen there too. A local schoolteacher, Miss Eleanor Graves, later told reporters that Jesse's drawings often unsettled her. Bridges over black water, faces without mouths, children with their eyes scratched out. She had shown them once to a visiting physician from the Massachusetts General Hospital, who dismissed it as nervous fancy. But as the thaw of 1868 came, so did the first undeniable evidence. Near a forgotten stretch of shoreline, a constable discovered a shallow pit lined with pieces of torn oilcloth and rope. What he found there, according to his official report, bore marks of deliberate cruelty, the work of a child imitating the worst impulses of a man. The constable's name, Henry Dalton, would later appear again in the sworn testimony of what became the most disturbing juvenile case the state had ever seen. The discovery near the shoreline unsettled even the most hardened of the Boston constables. Henry Dalton's notes, preserved in the Suffolk County archives, describe a child's handprint pressed into mud, too small for a man, too deliberate for play. He followed the trail to a thin brook leading toward the shipyard, where an old watch house stood half collapsed. Inside were candle stubs, a fragment of rope, and what appeared to be pages from a Sunday school primer, one smeared with a brown, rust-like stain. At first no one thought of Jesse. He was only a boy of 8 then, small, soft-voiced, always dressed neatly by his mother before lessons. The ministers at the Methodist chapel where Ruth Pomeroy worshipped often praised her piety. Yet in the narrow alleys, children whispered about Jesse's games, how he lured them behind warehouses to show them something he had caught. One boy said Jesse liked to press pins into the back of his hand just to see how long the pain would take to disappear. When another child went missing that spring, the name surfaced again. Witnesses claimed to have seen Jesse near the vacant lots on Broadway, his boots coated with gray marsh mud. But no arrest was made. The law was slow to suspect a child of deliberate harm. In early 1870, the Boston Police Gazette published a brief column under the title, "A Strange Boy in South Boston." It mentioned a lad who often visited the waterfront alone at night, staring out toward Castle Island, where the ruins of Fort Independence still stood. The writer noted, "He speaks of the fort as if it calls to him, a curious imagination for one so young." That same year, a surgeon named Dr. John Tyler, whose name appears in the Massachusetts Historical Society records, delivered a paper on child aberration and early manifestations of cruelty. Many believe he had heard of Jesse through the neighborhood gossip, though he never wrote the boy's name. Tyler argued that such behavior should not be dismissed as mischief but treated as disease. Meanwhile, Boston continued its ordinary life, church bells, horse carts, and the clang of shipyard hammers, unaware that something dark was forming beneath its calm surface. Jesse grew quieter, more secretive. His teachers remarked on his intelligence, his sharp memory, his cold correctness. Then, in 1871, the police received a trembling witness, a boy named George Pratt, barely 10 years old, who limped into a constable's office and said he had been taken to the marshes by Jesse. His account was confused, filled with tears but clear enough in one detail. Jesse had tied him to a post, hurt him and then released him, warning him not to tell. When Dalton read the report, he noted in the margin, the same eyes described, pale grey, unblinking. Boston had seen many crimes, but none that began so young. The ministers spoke of original sin. The doctors spoke of madness. And somewhere between them, the truth sat, as cold and silent as the boy himself. By the summer of 1871, fear had crept through South Boston's narrow streets like fog rolling off the harbor. Parents began walking their children to school instead of letting them wander in pairs. The rumor of a gray-eyed boy spread in whispers at grocers and bakeries. Nobody wanted to name him outright, partly from disbelief, partly from fear of being wrong. But the constables knew. They watched Jesse Pomeroy from a distance, his slim figure appearing at odd hours near the docks, his boots leaving thin tracks that always seemed to lead toward forgotten corners. Henry Dalton and 2 other officers eventually brought Jesse in for questioning. The report, dated July 12, 1871, still survives in fragments within Suffolk County's ledgers. It describes the boy sitting perfectly still on the wooden chair, hands folded neatly in his lap, answering every question without hesitation. When Dalton asked why several children described him leading them toward the marsh, Jesse smiled faintly and said, "They came because they wanted to see what I found." No details, no denial. His mother arrived soon after, indignant and pale. She told the officers her son had been home all morning, sewing buttons for her customers' coats. There was no proof otherwise, and the boy was released. Yet Dalton wrote privately in his notebook, "His composure unsettles me more than any confession could." The following autumn, the city seemed to move on. Winter markets opened, new buildings rose near the common, and the talk of the strange boy faded behind the sound of progress. But beneath the snow, Boston's poorer districts hid their unease. Dogs were found mutilated in the alleys. A school janitor discovered a set of small bones behind the furnace and quietly buried them without telling a soul. By 1872, Jesse had begun working part-time at a dry goods store near Dorchester Avenue. He was growing into adolescence, taller, thinner, his gaze sharper, his manner still unnervingly polite. The owner, Mr. Baird, later testified that Jesse rarely spoke, unless spoken to, and that he never seemed to blink. For long stretches of time, Baird dismissed him after customers complained that the boy watched their children too closely. In March of that same year, a group of boys playing near the old fort ruins found the remains of what the coroner described as a young victim, tortured before death. The city papers barely reported it, lost amid stories of political meetings and the expanding railway. Yet in private, constables recognized the pattern. A physician named Dr. Tyler, who had once mentioned Jesse's strange demeanor in his writings, was called again. He examined the evidence and wrote in his clinical notes, "Cruelty devoid of motive is its own form of madness." Boston must learn to see that. Still, no one spoke Jesse's name aloud. He walked the streets freely, quiet as snowfall, with eyes that seemed to see things others refused to. Spring of 1873 arrived with the city awakening from its long grey winter. The harbor thawed, carriages rattled down muddy lanes, and the hum of trade returned to Boston. Yet among the vendors and dockmen, an unease persisted. People spoke quietly of a boy who smiled at funerals and asked gravediggers strange questions about how long it took for faces to fade beneath the soil. No one dared confront him, for his mother was known to defend him fiercely, and sympathy for a widowed seamstress was deep in those working streets. In March, a letter reached the police office from Dr. John Tyler at the Massachusetts General Hospital. It referred obliquely to a youth exhibiting alarming fascinations with suffering. Tyler suggested observation for the safety of the public and the mind of the child himself. His plea was filed but ignored. The city was preoccupied with labor unrest and a rash of fires near the wharf. Only when a 10-year-old boy named Robert Meyer disappeared from South Boston in early April did Dalton's suspicions revive. Witnesses said they had seen Robert speaking with a taller youth by the name of Jesse, who promised to show him a hidden passage near the fort. 2 days later, a group of fishermen found blood-streaked stones along the causeway. Dalton went himself searching the reeds and uncovered what he later called a scene without reason, only cruelty. That night, the constable returned to the Pomeroy home with 2 officers. Ruth opened the door, clutching a candle, her face tense but resolute. Jesse was upstairs reading, a thin volume of Pilgrim's Progress open on his knees. When Dalton confronted him, Jesse's tone was measured, even gentle. "I thought I'd see what pain looks like when it leaves the body," he said simply. Ruth gasped, but Jesse only blinked once and continued, "It didn't look like I imagined. He was taken into custody the next morning, though the word arrest seemed misplaced. The court called it protective detention, as though the boy were both threat and victim." Boston's newspapers, once reluctant, now splashed his name in black print across the pages, the South Boston boy monster. Sermons thundered against sin and neglect. Doctors debated madness and heredity. Dr. Tyler visited the boy at the House of Reformation, where Jesse was confined. His notes, later archived, described the boy's calm demeanor, speaks as though recounting weather, not acts of horror, shows no understanding of remorse, only curiosity. Outside, the people of Boston whispered prayers and locked their doors at dusk. Mothers forbade their children from playing near the shoreline. Yet within the reformatory's walls, Jesse sat in his small cell, tracing invisible shapes on the stone, humming tunelessly. When a guard asked what he was drawing, Jesse replied, "It's a map for when they let me walk again." The chill that passed through that man would later appear in testimony, recorded simply as, "He smiled as if he knew something the rest of us had forgotten." The reformatory at West Roxbury stood cold and solemn, its brick walls rimmed with frost even in spring. Inside, the corridors smelled of lime and damp wool. Jesse Pomeroy was the youngest inmate by several years, yet the older boys kept their distance. They said he stared too long, spoke too softly, and dreamed aloud in ways that made the night watch uneasy. Guards reported hearing him murmur scripture in the dark, not in prayer, but as though repeating a riddle to himself. Dr. John Tyler, still fascinated by the case, visited him weekly. In his letters to the Massachusetts Medical Journal, Tyler wrote that the boy possessed reason without empathy, a mind sharp as frost but devoid of warmth. He urged the state to study such cases, warning that cruelty untended would ripen into something far worse. But officials saw Jesse as merely another delinquent, a boy to be disciplined through labor and isolation. For more than a year, Jesse worked in silence, polishing brass fixtures, sewing coarse garments, and writing small notes in the margins of his Bible. When his mother came each month, he greeted her politely, asked after business, and said he missed home. The staff called him model-behaved. In late 1874, a board of wardens, citing remarkable improvement, voted for his early release. Ruth met him at the gate that September morning. She brought him a clean jacket, a loaf of bread, and the promise of a second chance. They returned to their narrow house in South Boston, the same one that had watched over so many disappearances. Neighbors whispered, but time had dulled their memory. Children had grown older, families moved away, and the boy they once feared was now spoken of only in sighs and half-forgotten headlines. Yet within weeks of his return, animals began vanishing again. Cats, stray dogs, even a goat from the alley behind the butcher's shop. Jesse denied involvement with the same calm precision he had always shown. His mother defended him before all who questioned her, insisting her son had been reborn through faith and discipline. Then, in December of 1874, the body of a young boy named Horace Millen was found on the marshland near Dorchester. The condition of the remains was so brutal that even seasoned officers turned away. Dalton, now older and weary from years of unsolved misery, recognized the pattern instantly. He rode to South Boston before dawn, his lantern swinging through the mist, and found Jesse sitting on the steps outside his house, his hands folded. His boots streaked with mud. Dalton asked where he had been. Jesse looked up, eyes blank in the pale morning light, and said, "I went to see if pain could end differently this time." The silence that followed hung over Boston like smoke from a smoldering fire. The arrest was swift and quiet. There was no struggle when Dalton took Jesse by the arm and led him toward the waiting carriage. The morning fog clung to the cobblestones as the city began to stir, unaware that one of its most disturbing mysteries had just surfaced from the shadows. Ruth Pomeroy followed close behind, trembling yet composed, her voice breaking as she asked if it was truly necessary. Dalton did not answer. He had seen enough to know Mercy had long fled this matter. At the station, Jesse sat at the edge of a wooden bench, hands resting neatly in his lap. When questioned about Horace Millen, he described the scene with unnerving clarity. The reeds, the mud, the stillness of the water. "He didn't cry," Jesse added softly. "He just went quiet like the world does before rain." The officers stared at him, unable to tell whether the words were confession or recollection. The papers seized upon every detail. The Boston Globe and the Daily Advertiser printed lurid columns under headlines such as "The Boy Fiend" and "Murder in Miniature." Crowds gathered outside the jailhouse hoping to catch a glimpse of the pale youth, whose face seemed far too delicate for such deeds. Some shouted for the gallows. Others murmured prayers, pitying his mother more than him. During the initial hearing, the courtroom was so full that even the corridors were lined with spectators. Dr. John Tyler took the stand to testify about his earlier warnings, presenting notes he had written years before urging authorities to intervene. "The signs were there," he told the court, "but we mistook cruelty for mischief and curiosity for madness." He spoke calmly, almost regretfully, as though lecturing a class rather than describing horror. Jesse's demeanor remained unchanged throughout the proceedings. When witnesses recalled his past acts, he only tilted his head as though studying them. At one point, when asked why he had done it, he replied, "Because I wanted to know how long fear lasts." His words silenced the room. Even the judge sat motionless, pen hovering above parchment. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury found him guilty. Yet because of his age, the sentence was left to the governor's discretion. The recommendation was life imprisonment in solitary confinement, a fate considered at that time worse than death. Ruth fainted as the verdict was read. Jesse simply looked at the ceiling and smiled faintly, whispering something no one could hear. He was transferred to Charlestown State Prison, the same fortress-like structure where older men awaited hanging. His cell measured 6 feet by 8, a single slit of light cutting across the wall each morning. The warden recorded that Jesse adjusted easily, spending his hours reading the Bible and sketching maps in charcoal. Yet guards swore that at night, faint humming drifted from his cell, a child's tune, repeating endlessly, echoing down the cold stone corridor. Charlestown State Prison loomed over the harbor, like a relic of some older cruelty. Its granite walls caught the morning light in a dull gray sheen, and the gulls that circled above never seemed to land. The prison was built to house men broken by life, murderers, thieves, deserters, yet none among them caused the same unease as the boy in cell 43. Jesse Pomeroy had been given no number, only his name scratched into a small ledger by the warden himself. Within those first months, guards watched him closely. He never shouted, never cursed, never begged for favors. When they slid meals through the iron grate, he would thank them politely and return to reading. His voice had the steady tone of a clerk reciting figures, even when discussing matters that would unsettle most men. A chaplain assigned to the prison wrote that Jesse's eyes had a way of finding you, as if he were measuring the distance between your thoughts. Letters from Ruth Pomeroy arrived weekly. She refused to accept the word murderer, calling her son a poor, misunderstood soul whose sickness was mistaken for sin. She petitioned the governor again and again, pleading that Jesse be given lessons, exercise, sunlight. Some papers sympathized, calling it the tragedy of a mother's blind faith. Others were less kind. One editorial in the Boston Herald wrote, "Mercy has its place, but it does not live in Charlestown's shadows." Inside the cell, Jesse kept a journal, fragments of thoughts written in careful hand on scraps of old invoices and torn envelopes. Some of the pages survived, stored now in the Massachusetts archives. One entry reads, "They think I am alone, but I hear them in the walls, the ones that never finish screaming." Another, "When I sleep, the boy comes back not angry, just waiting." In 1880, Dr. John Tyler, now older and more solemn, requested permission to interview Jessie once more. The visit lasted only 20 minutes, yet Tyler's later notes mention that the prisoner showed no degradation of intellect, only a deepening stillness. When asked if he regretted what he had done, Jessie said, "If I said yes, it would only be because you expect it." The doctor left pale and shaken. His report to the medical board concluded, "We have not yet named what he is. Perhaps we never will." Years passed and the world outside moved on. Electric lights came to Boston, new bridges were built and wars rose overseas. But in Charlestown, Jessie remained unchanged, a relic from another century untouched by time. Guards came and went, each leaving with the same memory. A thin, white-faced man who smiled faintly at their fear. At night, during inspection, some claimed they heard him whispering through the keyhole, asking softly, "Do you believe pain dies or only changes shape?" None ever answered. By 1885, the legend of Jessie Pomeroy had already begun to drift beyond the prison walls, carried in whispers across New England taverns and boarding houses. Travelers passing through Charlestown claimed they could see his shadow at the barred window when the moon rose, a pale shape that never seemed to move. Some insisted the boy had made a pact with death itself, that his youth had frozen on the day he entered those walls. Others said the governor dared not sign his execution warrant because strange accidents always followed whenever it was discussed. Ruth Pomeroy continued her weekly visits until illness confined her to her bed. She would sit across from the thick glass pane in the visitation room, pressing her palm against the barrier, as Jessie stared back, his expression unreadable. Her final petition in 1886 pleaded that her son be transferred to a hospital. "He is no longer the creature they fear," she wrote. "He is only my boy trapped in time." The request was denied. She died that winter, and the next day Jessie refused his meal for the first time in years. A month later, a guard named Edmund Keating reported an unsettling incident. Making rounds before dawn, he found Jessie awake, standing in the center of his cell, staring at the opposite wall. When asked what he was looking at, Jessie replied, "She just left. But her handprint is still warm." Keating noted the remark, but no mark was ever found. Outside, Boston's people had grown weary of his story. The new generation spoke of inventions, factories, and expansion, not of a boy who once embodied their nightmares. But the academics did not forget. In 1890, a psychology lecturer at Harvard mentioned the Pomeroy phenomenon as one of the earliest recorded examples of juvenile cruelty without motive. His students debated whether evil could exist in a child untouched by poverty or madness. None could decide. Through those years, Jessie aged slowly, as though the stone walls absorbed his time. Visitors who glimpsed him said he looked not 50 but scarcely 30. His hair grayed unevenly, and his voice never lost its quiet tone. Inmates began to fear him as something unnatural. One swore that during a thunderstorm, when the lights flickered, Jessie's cell remained bright even after the lamps went dark. In 1905, nearly 4 decades after his imprisonment, a journalist from the Boston Evening Transcript requested an interview. The warden allowed it, hoping the story might finally dull public curiosity. The reporter described the encounter in detail. "He rose when I entered, spoke gently, and asked if the world still believed in monsters. When told it did, Jessie smiled faintly and said, 'Then they'll never forget me.' That article reignited interest for a brief time, spawning pamphlets, sermons, and lurid retellings of his crimes. Yet within months silence returned. The boy who terrified a city became a ghost in its own history, present only in records and uneasy memories. Still, guards claimed that sometimes, when the wind pressed through the corridors, they could hear faint laughter echoing through the stone, not mocking, not cruel, just a reminder that he was still there. By 1910, Charlestown Prison had changed. Electricity buzzed through the corridors, where once only oil lamps flickered. Guards wore newer uniforms, younger men who knew Jessie Pomeroy only as a legend told by their predecessors. Most had not been born when he first entered those gates. Yet whenever they passed his cell, their steps slowed. His presence seemed to unsettle even the confident ones, not because he was violent, but because he was quiet. Terribly quiet. Warden Samuel Knox, appointed that same year, was among the few who dared speak to him at length. In one of his surviving journals, Knox described the encounter. He greeted me with courtesy, thanked me for visiting, and asked how the city looked beyond the harbor. When I said Boston had grown bright and crowded, he smiled and said, "Then the darkness had to move somewhere else." Despite decades of confinement, Jesse remained articulate and strangely gentle. He read newspapers that arrived through the prison library, clipping articles about science and medicine. One clipping, preserved among his possessions after his death, concerned new studies on the brain and moral insanity. Across its margin, Jesse had written in pencil, "They keep looking for it in the head instead of the heart." Some who studied his case saw him as a relic of an age when cruelty was called sin instead of sickness. Others feared his composure was proof of something deeper, a reflection of a darkness humanity still could not name. Dr. Tyler had died long before, but his students continued citing the Pomeroy case in lectures, warning that society must never confuse curiosity with compassion again. The prison staff began noticing oddities that year. A guard named Thomas Laird swore he saw candlelight flicker in Jesse's cell long after the lamps were extinguished. Another claimed that the humming, the same faint, tuneless sound reported decades earlier, had returned. Warden Knox dismissed these tales as nerves, yet in his final entry he admitted, "Even I hear it now and then, when the corridors are empty." Jesse's health began to fail around 1913. Arthritis bent his hands, his sight dimmed, but his memory remained unnervingly sharp. He recalled every name, every question, every visitor who had ever stood before his cell. Once, when a young chaplain tried to speak to him about repentance, Jesse said softly, "The world has sinned more than I ever could. It only calls its sins progress." He spent his last years writing fragments of poetry and sketching rough maps of places no one recognized, islands, ruins, corridors that led nowhere. When asked what they represented, he said, "They're the places where thoughts go when you stop believing in forgiveness." By the winter of 1914, the guards noticed he had grown quieter still, barely moving except to turn a page. On a cold December morning, when they came to deliver breakfast, they found him sitting upright, eyes closed as if listening. The warden's record notes simply, "Inmate found deceased, peaceful expression, body undisturbed." Outside the prison, no church bells rang. Only the harbor wind carried the faint echo of a name that Boston had long tried to forget. The record of Jesse Pomeroy's death was as plain as the paper it was written on. No ceremony marked the passing of the boy who had terrified an entire city. The clerk of Charlestown Prison signed the entry with a shaking hand, as though relieved the story had finally ended. But in Boston, endings rarely hold. When word of his death reached the city, only one newspaper ran a short obituary. Jesse Pomeroy, once known as the boy murderer, has died in Charlestown Prison at the age of 54. No photograph accompanied the notice, no remembrance of family or legacy. Yet that night a chill swept through South Boston, and many older residents said they felt something lift, as if the city itself exhaled after nearly half a century of holding its breath. Weeks later, a small package arrived at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Inside were several sheets of paper, wrapped in coarse cloth and labeled in a thin, precise hand, to be opened when cruelty is studied, not judged. The handwriting was unmistakably Jesse's. The contents were stranger still. The first page contained a drawing of the harbor as seen from the Charlestown window, but the proportions were wrong. The waterline too high, the bridges bent like reeds. Beneath it, a single sentence read, "The sea remembers." The next sheet showed the outline of a boy's face, half in shadow, half erased. Scribbled at the bottom, "They said I was alone, but I was only the first." Archivists debated for years whether these were the ravings of a dying mind or the deliberate reflections of a man long forgotten by compassion. Either way, they were locked away in a small folder marked "Confidential." Pomeroy case papers. Charlestown Prison itself began to decay soon after. Leaks spread through the roof. The lower cells flooded each spring, and whispers of strange noises circulated among the guards. Some claimed to hear a child crying faintly through the pipes at night. When the warden ordered renovations in 1916, workers uncovered a series of symbols scratched deep into the back wall of Jesse's cell. Circles, spirals, and a single word carved again and again. Listen. The mason who found them refused to finish his work. He told his foreman the letters seemed to hum when light struck them. The story spread through the workforce until, at last, the cell was sealed completely. By the 1920s, the city had changed beyond recognition. Electric trams rattled down Tremont Street, and skyscrapers cast long shadows where the old brick homes once stood. The new generation had never heard of Jesse Pomeroy, but the old marsh road near Dorchester still drew the curious. Some said the ground there never froze properly in winter. That mist rose even on dry days. Fishermen swore they sometimes found small footprints pressed into the mud beside the causeway, prints that led nowhere, ending abruptly at the water's edge. No one ever proved what they meant. But in the archives of the city, the old constable's words still lingered on the brittle paper of his report. His composure unsettles me more than any confession could. Decades passed, and Boston's skyline climbed higher, its past buried beneath layers of stone and glass. Yet the name Jesse Pomeroy refused to fade completely. Every few years, an article or pamphlet would resurface, usually written by some eager historian, fascinated with the first American child murderer. Each retelling was met with the same uneasy silence, as if the city itself preferred its ghosts unspoken. In 1931, during renovations to expand the harbor railway, workers unearthed a rusted lockbox half buried near the old shoreline at Dorchester. Inside were brittle scraps of paper sealed in wax, along with a child's brass button and a short strip of rope. The papers contained barely legible handwriting, fragments of a confession or perhaps a journal. On one torn piece were the words, "It never ended." "They keep calling from the marsh." The find was reported to the authorities, but the documents vanished into storage, later mislabeled and forgotten. The men who discovered them told their families strange tales about how the water had turned darker that day, the tide pulling back farther than usual. By then, the prison at Charlestown had fallen into ruin. Most of the older wings were sealed off after a fire in 1932. The official report blamed faulty wiring. Yet one of the surviving guards swore he had seen smoke rising from the very corridor where Jesse's cell had been sealed years earlier. When investigators returned the next morning, the air smelled faintly of burned paper and iron, but the stones of cell 43 remained untouched, cold and clean. In the years that followed, Charlestown became a destination for curious students of criminology. Professors lectured about Pomeroy's case, calling it a milestone in American psychology. They spoke of inherited violence, early trauma, and scientific theories of moral insanity. Yet those who visited the remains of the old prison often left uneasy, complaining of echoes that did not match their footsteps. By 1940, most of the site had been demolished. Only a single wall survived, left standing as part of a storage facility overlooking the harbor. But locals said that on certain foggy nights, the stones seemed to sweat with moisture, even when the air was dry. One caretaker swore he heard humming, faint, rhythmic, almost like a child's tune carried by the tide. In the archives, the name Jesse Pomeroy began to appear less frequently. It was no longer a subject of moral debate, just a footnote in the evolution of criminal study. But every so often, a visitor to the Massachusetts Historical Society asked to see the sealed Pomeroy case papers. The archivist would shake his head, explaining they were missing after the 1919 flood. The visitor usually smiled and left, saying nothing more, and yet, when those same archivists worked late, they claimed they sometimes heard a page turning in the locked reading room, slow, deliberate, as though someone unseen was still studying the past he had written himself. In the winter of 1951, a researcher from Cambridge named Dr. Leonard Hume reopened the case for a psychological thesis on the origins of cruelty. His colleagues mocked the idea of revisiting a crime nearly a century old, but Hume believed something essential had been overlooked. He wrote in his journal, "The records speak too softly. There is something they refuse to say aloud." He spent months tracing the original court transcripts, Tyler's medical notes, and Dalton's personal diary. The deeper he went, the more inconsistencies appeared, missing dates, rewritten testimonies, and signatures that didn't match. Even the autopsy report of Horace Millen seemed altered, pages replaced by cleaner copies. It was as if someone had carefully rewritten Boston's darkest story to make it more bearable. In April, Hume was granted permission to inspect the remnants of Charlestown Prison before a new government warehouse was built on the site. The building was nearly gone by then, its walls cracked and roof half collapsed. The smell of salt and soot hung in the air. Guided by an elderly caretaker, he found the remains of the old cell block, damp, echoing, almost cathedral-like in its decay. The caretaker, who had worked there since the 1920s, pointed toward a sealed doorway. "That's the boys' cell," he whispered. "We bricked it up after the fire. It's best left quiet." Hume persuaded him to pry a single stone loose for examination. Inside was darkness, stale and cold, and the faint odor of rusted metal. He lowered a lantern and saw only dust and a small rectangle carved into the back wall. One word still visible beneath the grime: "Listen." When Hume asked if the inscription had ever been documented, the caretaker shook his head. No one wanted to write about it. Not after what happened. He refused to explain further, only urging the researcher to leave before nightfall. That evening, Hume stayed in his lodging on Tremont Street, writing feverishly about his discovery. His final entry read, "The air inside that cell was wrong. It was as if it had been waiting to breathe." The next morning, his landlady found his notebook open and the lamp still burning. Hume himself was gone. Police later found his coat and papers on a bench overlooking the harbor. But no body was recovered. The incident received only a brief mention in the Boston Globe. Local academic missing, a presumed drowned. The article included a curious line. Residents near the waterfront reported hearing faint music the night before, like a lullaby carried by the tide. In the archives, a clerk later discovered that one document Hume had borrowed, Dr. Tyler's final letter about Pomeroy, was also missing. The letter's index card remains in the catalogue, marked simply, "Not returned," and so the case of Jesse Pomeroy found new life, not in courts or confessions, but in disappearances that repeated themselves, echoing across the decades like a story determined never to end. By the late 1960s, Boston had turned modern, restless, full of light and noise, a place that no longer remembered its ghosts. Yet among the aging police clerks and archivists, the name Jesse Pomeroy still moved like a low current. When the harbor wind blew a certain way, the old men swore they could smell salt and soot, mixed with something faintly metallic, as if memory itself had a scent. A graduate student named Ellen Mark stumbled upon the Pomeroy files while researching early juvenile reform. The folder was thin, water-damaged, but one envelope inside had never been catalogued. It contained the faded photograph of a boy, eyes pale and distant, with a hand resting on a Bible. Across the back, someone had written, "Taken before the world stopped trusting children." The handwriting matched Dalton's notes. Ellen grew obsessed. She began visiting every known site connected to the case. The former Pomeroy home in South Boston, now divided into apartments, the marshlands of Dorchester, where fog still clung low, and the overgrown ruins of Charlestown Prison, whose last wall still faced the harbor like a monument to regret. Each location seemed to echo faintly, as though time itself hadn't fully sealed. Neighbors told her the strangest things. An elderly woman living near Broadway claimed that her grandfather had known the Pomeroys, and that Ruth's sewing room sometimes smelled of seawater. A dock worker said his father once saw a boy standing knee-deep in the Yee, harbor mud decades after Jesse's death, a boy, who smiled and then vanished when approached. Ellen dismissed these as folklore, until one evening she visited the ruins alone. It was near twilight, the air heavy and grey. She carried her tape recorder, hoping to capture ambient sound for her thesis. Standing before the sealed remains of Cell 43, she pressed record. The first minute was only wind and distant gulls. Then a faint sound emerged, a hum, rhythmic and low like someone breathing through the walls. She turned off the recorder and listened. It stopped instantly. Back at her apartment, she played the tape again. The hum was there, unmistakable. But beneath it, faint as dust, another voice whispered a single word. "Listen." When she submitted the recording to her supervisor, he dismissed it as interference. the echo of machinery or static from the harbor's power lines. Ellen accepted his explanation publicly, but privately she knew better. The frequency was too deliberate, the rhythm too human. She transcribed the sound wave and found that its peaks matched the exact spacing of Jesse's name when written in cursive. Weeks later, Ellen vanished while cataloguing materials in the university basement. Her desk lamp was found still burning, the Pomeroy file open beside it. On the last page of her notebook, in a hurried hand, she had written, "He was right. The air has been waiting to breathe. Her disappearance was never solved." The file was sealed once again, labeled, "Do not circulate, historical disturbance case." By the time the 1980s arrived, Boston's historians spoke of the Pomeroy case with the same distant tone reserved for old maritime tragedies. Yet the name persisted quietly, resurfacing in graduate papers, newspaper retrospectives, and late-night broadcasts about America's earliest monsters. One such program aired in 1983 on local television, featuring a young journalist named Daniel Rourke, who claimed to have obtained lost documents from the Massachusetts Historical Society. He promised to reveal the truth the city buried. The broadcast was ordinary enough at first: sepia photographs, court sketches, maps of the old Dorchester marshes. But halfway through, Rourke showed a fragment of Jesse's alleged writings. A small scrap photographed under glass, reading, "Pain does not vanish, it waits." The words were barely visible, written in faint graphite strokes. The segment drew record viewership that night, yet something unexpected followed. Two technicians who handled the footage reported hearing faint music on the master tape, a soft, looping hum beneath the narrator's voice. They rechecked their equipment but found no source. The next morning, one of the men refused to return to the studio, claiming he'd heard the same tune while walking home through the rain. Within a week, the station received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single Polaroid of Charlestown's crumbling wall and a note, "You've opened it again." Rourke dismissed the warnings publicly, calling them superstition, but privately, his co-workers noticed he'd grown withdrawn. During editing sessions, he often paused, staring at the screen long after the footage had ended. A colleague later recalled him whispering, "He's still young in there. He's still watching." Months later, Rourke disappeared while driving along the harbor road near Dorchester. His car was found parked by the water, doors unlocked, headlights still burning. Inside were his camera, a tape recorder, and a notebook. The tape captured only waves and the faint sound of humming. The notebook's final line read, "He asked me if pain dies or only changes shape. Authorities ruled it an accident." The program was pulled from circulation, its master copy sealed in evidence storage. Yet bootleg recordings circulated through Boston's underground collectors, gaining cult fascination. Some claimed that when the tape was played backward, a voice could be heard whispering, "Listen." By the late 1980s, Charlestown's last war was finally demolished to make way for a new office complex. During excavation, workers uncovered a patch of soil darker than the rest, as if soaked by something long ago. Beneath it lay fragments of old masonry, etched faintly with symbols, circles, spirals, and one word repeated 3 times, "Remember." The pieces were sent for analysis but vanished in transit, never logged into any record. The office building opened a year later. Employees complained of cold drafts, whispering vents, and lights that flickered only in the east corridor, the one aligned with where cell 43 had once stood. Maintenance found nothing wrong. At night, janitors said they sometimes heard a boy's voice humming softly in the dark. None of them stayed long. By the early 2000s, the name Jesse Pomeroy belonged mostly to history books and internet footnotes. True crime forums debated his motives, skeptics called the stories exaggerated, and amateur historians tried piecing together timelines lost to damaged records. Yet among archivists and Boston locals, a quieter legend endured, one that had nothing to do with the murders themselves. They said his presence never left the harbor. In 2004, a maintenance crew working night shifts inside the Charlestown office complex began reporting strange malfunctions. Security cameras near the East Corridor would freeze for precisely 13 seconds every night at 3:17 a.m., then resume with no footage missing, only a faint static hum on the audio track. The building's power engineers replaced wiring, checked transformers, even brought in sound technicians. Nothing explained it. A young guard named Matthew Keene, new to the job, began investigating the phenomenon on his own. He spent nights watching the corridor from the monitoring booth, coffee growing cold beside him. One night, he saw movement on the screen. A pale flicker shaped vaguely like a child standing motionless near the far wall. He blinked, leaned closer, but when the feed stabilized, the hallway was empty. When he played the recording back, the figure was gone, yet the sound remained. A faint, rhythmic hum. Keene shared the footage with his supervisor, who dismissed it as compression error. Still, word spread quietly among the staff. Some refused to patrol that wing after midnight. Others began placing small offerings, coins, folded notes, even a child's toy, near the old brick fragment preserved in the lobby, one of the last pieces from the original prison wall. The janitors swore the items disappeared by morning. Curiosity turned into obsession for Keene. He read every surviving record he could find about the case, even tracking down microfilms of Dalton's reports and Dr. Tyler's writings. He discovered that the warden's journals from 1914 described hearing humming the night before Jesse's death, the same melody later captured on Rourke's tape, the same rhythm found on modern recordings. It had persisted for over a century, changing medium but never vanishing. Determined to prove it wasn't coincidence, Keene set up his phone to record live audio from the corridor over 3 consecutive nights. On the third night at exactly 3:17 a.m., the feed distorted. His microphone picked up breathing, slow, deliberate, like someone standing inches from the device. Then a child's voice whispered a single word, "Listen." The recording went viral briefly after Keene posted it anonymously online. Commenters debated whether it was a hoax, but those who lived near Charlestown claimed they recognized the sound. It resembled the echo that sometimes drifted across the harbor before storms. Weeks later, Keene stopped coming to work. His apartment was found unlocked, his keys still on the counter. The only thing missing was his phone. Police traced its signal to the docks but recovered nothing. On his desk lay an open notebook containing one line written over and over, "The sea remembers." No one ever patrolled the East Corridor again. By 2016, the Charlestown office complex had changed owners twice. Few remembered what stood there before the glass towers and polished floors. To most, it was simply another building with a long, unremarkable lease, until a series of small, unexplained disturbances revived the whispers that had once haunted the harbor. The first came in January, when an overnight janitor named Luis Ortega reported hearing a young voice singing under the vents. He dismissed it as exhaustion until he found his mop bucket slowly rocking on its own, the water trembling as though from sound vibrations. When he told his supervisor, she laughed and told him old buildings make old noises. 2 nights later, Ortega quit, leaving behind his keys and a note reading, "There's someone in the walls humming." In March, the building's elevators began malfunctioning, stopping at the 13th floor, even though the panel had no such button. Technicians were called, but every inspection found the wiring untouched. Employees joked about the ghost floor, but few rode alone after dark. That same spring, a historian named Rachel Devine from Boston University began researching urban legends tied to historic prisons. She stumbled upon the Pomeroy story through digitized archives, Dalton's surviving reports, Tyler's papers, even a transcript of Dr. Hume's lost journal, miraculously rediscovered in an estate sale. She noticed a peculiar pattern. Every researcher who reopened the case seemed to vanish, drown, or die abruptly. Rachel decided to visit the office building itself. She gained access through a maintenance permit, entering late one evening with her recorder and notes. The security footage from that night still exists, though heavily degraded. It shows her walking toward the East Corridor, stopping by the old brick fragment displayed behind glass. For several minutes she stands motionless. Then faint condensation forms on the glass, as though something breathed from the other side. She lifts her hand, tracing a circle, and mouths a word that lip readers later identified as "listen." The next morning, the guards found the recorder still running on the lobby floor. The tape captured 40 minutes of silence, followed by a single exhale and a voice whispering, "He's not gone." Rachel was never seen again. Boston police filed the case as missing under unusual circumstances. Reporters covered it briefly, speculating about abduction or mental breakdown. But those who worked in the building said the air changed afterward, colder, heavier, as if holding its breath. Some claimed they could smell salt water in the elevators. A year later, during renovations, construction workers broke into a sealed maintenance shaft behind the East Corridor. Inside was an alcove of crumbling stone that appeared older than the rest of the structure. Scratched into one wall, still visible beneath the dust, were faint letters shaped like a child's handwriting. JP. The shaft was resealed that same week, and management forbade employees from discussing it. Yet the security staff swore that after midnight, faint humming resumed in the vents, the same slow, tuneless rhythm recorded decades earlier on Rourke's tape. Boston had grown taller, louder, faster, but in the East Corridor of that polished building, one sound never aged. In 2022, a small documentary team from a streaming network chose the Charlestown site for a new true crime series titled The Boy Behind the Walls. Their director, Mark Ellison, wanted to revisit forgotten American legends with scientific rigor. He believed Jesse Pomeroy's tale was perfect, provable records, lingering folklore, and a location that still existed. He told his crew, half joking, "We'll film history where it actually happened." What could go wrong? Filming began in late October. The team set up cameras throughout the East Corridor, positioning thermal scanners and microphones inside the old maintenance shaft. At first, nothing unusual occurred, but as midnight approached, their instruments began to pick up a low-frequency pulse. The audio engineer, listening through his headset, described it as breathing made of static. When he removed the headset, he swore he still heard it faintly in the room. The crew continued recording for 3 nights. Each time the temperature dropped precisely at 3:17 a.m., the same minute documented by Keane nearly 2 decades earlier. The footage captured a subtle distortion of light near the wall where the initials JP were carved. It was not a shadow or reflection. It seemed to move independently, as if observing the camera. On the 4th night, Ellison conducted an on-camera monologue. He stood before the wall and recited lines from Dalton's century-old testimony, "His composure unsettles me more than any confession could." As he spoke the words, the boom mic recorded an extra voice whispering the final syllables along with him. Every person present heard it. The crew fled the set, leaving their equipment behind. When they returned at dawn, several of the digital files had corrupted. The only footage recovered showed a close-up of the wall, the camera shaking slightly, and a child's voice humming in the background. For a single frame, a reflection appeared in the glass casing of the brick fragment, pale, expressionless, eyes like fog. The timestamp read 3:17 exactly. The footage leaked online before the network could suppress it. Viewers slowed it frame by frame, debating authenticity, dissecting the blurred outline of the face. Experts claimed it was compression error. Paranormal enthusiasts called it proof. The video amassed millions of views before being taken down. Ellison gave one final interview weeks later. His voice trembled as he admitted he'd gone back alone to retrieve the last camera. "The humming stopped," he said, "but the air, God!" The air was moving. When asked what he meant, he stared off camera and replied, "It was breathing." Days afterward, Ellison resigned and left the city. None of his crew ever spoke publicly again. The network quietly shelved the project, citing technical complications, yet security guards working the night shift say that on the anniversary of the first broadcast every October 30th, they still hear faint music rising through the vents, a child's tune lost to time. It always stops at 3:17 a.m., leaving behind only silence and the distant scent of salt. Time has a strange way of folding over Boston's harbor. The city grows brighter, taller, louder, yet beneath its steel and glass something older still stirs, a quiet that refuses to die. The Charlestown building stands now as just another office address, its lobby filled with polished marble and glass. But anyone who has worked there long enough knows that the East Corridor carries its own weather. The air there is heavier, colder, and carries a faint hum like wind through a keyhole. In 2025, a night security contractor named Adrian Holt was hired to oversee the building after multiple reports of system interference. He was pragmatic, a veteran with no patience for superstition. The first week passed uneventfully until one night, his phone picked up a Wi-Fi signal labeled Cell 43. Curious, he followed the signal strength, until it led him straight to the preserved brick fragment in the corridor display. The closer he came, the louder his phone's speaker buzzed. Thinking it a prank, Adrian recorded a short video. In the footage, later found on his device, he can be heard saying, "There's no network here, no router. So who's broadcasting?" Seconds later, the audio warped, forming a low vibration like someone exhaling against glass. Then a child's voice, faint but clear, whispered, "You opened it again." The video ended there. When investigators recovered the phone, the file was corrupted, frozen on a single frame of the wall, its reflection showing what appeared to be a face half-formed in the glare. Holt vanished that same week. His patrol note stopped at 3:17 a.m. Afterward, the building's management sealed the east corridor entirely, citing infrastructure repairs. No public statement mentioned the disappearance. Tenants relocated to higher floors, and the space fell into silence once more. But on certain foggy nights, fishermen moored along the harbor where they can see a faint light flicker through the office windows, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. In the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society, the last file-marked Pomeroy case remains empty. The pages were removed decades ago, leaving only an imprint of handwriting pressed faintly into the folder's lining, the ghost of words that once existed. Under the right light, archivists say one phrase is still legible: "The sea remembers," whether it is coincidence or consequence. The tide near the old Charlestown site still recedes deeper than any other point along the bay. Locals avoid the docks after midnight. They claim that if you stand there long enough, you can hear faint laughter threading through the wind. Not cruel, not joyous, just aware. No official record connects these events. No historian claims proof. Yet across 160 years of Boston's memory, one whisper endures through paper, stone, and steel, the same word carved into a prison wall, scrawled on lost letters, caught in the static of forgotten recordings. Listen, and when the harbor grows still and the night holds its breath, the city obeys. It listens.